Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar, and thanks very much to Reverse the Red for hosting us today. Today, we'll be talking about assessing recovery and conservation impact with the green status of species, how and why you should get involved. So thank you very much for joining us. My name is Molly Grace. I'm based at the University of Oxford, and I am the co-chair of the IUCN SSC Green Status of Species SSC Integration Task Force. What a mouthful. So Green Status Task Force for short. I'm joined on the panel today by Claudia Hermes, who is the Red List Officer at BirdLife International, and by Mike Hoffman, who is also part of the Green Status Task Force and is the head of wildlife recovery at the Zoological Society of London. Also with us today, who will be joining for the Q&A, we have Dr. Becca Young, who is also a part of the Green Status Task Force, and she's going to be monitoring your questions in the Q&A, answering questions where she can, and picking up some really good questions for us to have during the live Q&A session at the end. So how today's session will work is, and Mike will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes each. I will be talking about what is the IUCN Green Status of Species, how does it work? Then Claudia will talk about her perspective as a BirdLife Red List officer and why the Green Status of Species has been useful to her organization. And then finally, Mike will tell you about some resources and guidelines that are available to help you if you want to conduct green status assessments yourself. So without further ado, because we only have an hour here together today, I'll go ahead and get started by giving you a little overview of the IUCN Green Status of Species. So for those of you who haven't heard of the green status before, this is actually the latest addition to the Red List of Threatened Species. This was formalized by IUCN in 2021, so fairly recently. And what the Green Status of Species does is it introduces new metrics accompanying our familiar extinction risk category of the Red List, new metrics that measure successful conservation and species recovery. Now, why would we want to do this? Why would we want to introduce an entirely new element to the Red List of Threatened Species that we all know and love? Well, one of the main driving factors behind the development of the Green Status of Species is this question: what is conservation success? What exactly do we mean by conservation success? As we know, the Red List traditionally measures conservation success by a reduction in extinction risk. So a species moving from a higher risk category, like critically endangered, to a lower risk category, like near threatened or least concern. But over the past few decades, conservation scientists and practitioners have started to wonder, is avoiding extinction enough? Are there other things that we should be considering when we're thinking about successful conservation of species? And one of those things is thinking about recovery. However, recovery didn't have a formal definition until fairly recently with the Green Status of Species. But if we think about it conceptually and how we were thinking about it at the time the Green Status was developed, you might think of recovery existing on a hypothetical axis from 0 to 100%. So where 0 represents an extinct species and 100% equals a fully recovered species. Now, if we compare that to our Red List extinction risk categories, a species that is extinct or extinct in the wild on the Red List, that obviously maps on really clearly to our extinct 0% recovered. But the real question, the real interesting question was, where would a least concerned species fall on this recovery spectrum? Would it be a fully recovered species at 100%, or would it be somewhere else on that spectrum? And we didn't know the answer to that question. And with that goal in mind, the Green Status began to be developed. The driving principles behind this are that extinction is a thing that we want to avoid, but recovery is a thing that we want to achieve. And we had no standardized way of measuring that before the Green Status was introduced. And so the Green Status of Species is a new approach that tells us how close to recovery is our focal species and how close can we get it in the future. Now, the Green Status of Species has two primary aims. So the first is to measure species recovery, and the second is to assess the impact of and incentivize conservation action. So I'll spend a little bit of time focusing on how exactly the Green Status measures species recovery and how it does it in a standardized way. So the first aim of measuring species recovery in the IUCN Green Status of Species Standard which is a document that IUCN published in 2021, we propose the definition of a fully recovered species. We consider a species fully recovered if it is viable and ecologically functional in each part of its indigenous range. And you can see from those ellipses there in between indigenous and range that this assessment might be a little more complicated than I can tell you about in a short webinar, but this is the driving principle. So I'm going to give you sort of the basics of the assessment. Now, if we took that definition, hold it in our minds for a second, and we think about our axis of recovery and turn it on its side, we have what we could call a species recovery score ranging from 0 to 100%. And seeing that definition again, if a species met that definition of a fully recovered species, it gets a score of 100%. However, most species are going to be pretty far from recovery. They might be at different places along that road to recovery. And so it's not usually going to be at 100%. And just like in the red list, we can take this species recovery score and convert them into categories to make it easier to communicate with people the recovery status of the species. So starting up at 100%, we have a species that is fully recovered or non-depleted. Then moving down closer to 0, we go through the categories slightly depleted, moderately depleted, largely depleted, critically depleted, and finally at 0, we have extinct in the wild. So these are all categories of the green status that a species could be assigned to. And what's really great about this is that now we have two different languages that we can use to talk about a species conservation status. We have our familiar extinction risk categories with the red list, but we also have language to talk about where the species is on the road to recovery. Because you have species that are least concern, but actually could be very far from recovery. And to show you that, the species recovery category is not just the opposite of the red list category. So critically endangered species aren't always really far from recovery and vice versa. Here's 3 examples of published assessments that are all considered moderately depleted on the green status. So they have a species recovery score between 50 and 80%. And you can see that they vary greatly in their actual red list categories. So we have the vicuña, which is a least concerned species, the American horseshoe crab, which is a vulnerable species, and the Roatan spiny-tailed iguana, which is an endangered species. So all of these different extinction risk species have the same species recovery category on the green status. Now you may be wondering, how is this mystical species recovery score calculated? And I'll give you a very brief overview of how that's done today. So coming back to our definition, we consider a species fully recovered that is viable and ecologically functional in each part of its indigenous range. Let's break that down bit by bit. So starting with the idea of indigenous range, this is the first step in a green status of species assessment. You want to identify the species baseline distribution, where it was found prior to major human impacts. This is important because if we want to recover a species, there has to be some baseline that we are recovering to or measuring against. And so in this example, the cheetah prior to the 1900s was distributed much more widely, you can see in that light green, than it is today. So if we were doing a green status assessment for the cheetah, we would be considering all of that area in green, not just the dark green area that the species is currently found. So all of that area would be considered the species indigenous range. The next part of this recovery definition is parts of the range. So what do we mean by that? So the next step of the green status assessment is to take that indigenous range and divide it into spatial units. And spatial units are biologically or ecologically relevant divisions that can be used to show variation in status of a species. Because we know that species don't always have uniform status across their range. It might be doing really well in some parts of the range and poorly in others. Now, the cheetah has not actually been officially assessed for the green status of species. This is just preliminary. But you can see that there are different subspecies recognized, which may lead spatial units with which to think about potential variation across the species. And then finally, a species is fully recovered if it is both viable and ecologically functional in each of those parts of the range, each of those spatial units. Now, by viable, if you are familiar with the red list, this is pretty straightforward. You simply perform a regional red list assessment in each of those spatial units. And if the species is least concern or near threatened and not declining in those spatial units, it is considered viable. So that's pretty straightforward. And this is important because obviously the first goal in successful conservation is making sure that species are viable and not threatened. But then the green status goes one step further by thinking about this idea of an ecologically functional species within each of those spatial units. And an ecologically functional population is a viable population in a spatial unit that also exhibits its full range of ecological interactions, functions, and other roles in the ecosystem. So a classic example of this are highly interactive species such as sea otters, which perform a really important ecological role by regulating sea urchin populations. If the number of otters falls too low, then sea urchin populations increase, which often has very detrimental effects on the kelp populations in those areas. So a very clear sort of function of the sea otter and a very clear way of knowing whether the species is being functional or not in an area. You might be thinking, this might be hard to do for some species. Fear not. So there's many ways that you can think about, is a species ecologically functional in a spatial unit? So you can either observe the function, like you can see with the sea otter. If you're not exactly sure what a functional population would look like, but you know what a dysfunctional population would look like, you can use that as a marker, or you could use some sort of proxy like carrying capacity. And we have a paper about this in Conservation Biology published in 2020. If you want to read more, it goes into a lot more detail than I can now. So going back to our hypothetical cheetah assessment, again, this is not published, but it's just a really nice example. The third step of the green status assessment is to assess the state in each spatial unit. So the states that you could assign to each of those parts of the range in different colors there, you could have present or viable. So a viable spatial unit is one that's not threatened. A present population is one that is there in the spatial unit, but it is not viable, so it is threatened. You could have a spatial unit that is absent. So the species used to be there at the baseline, but is no longer there due to human activity. And then finally, the best possible state is functional. So a species that is both viable and fulfilling its ecological functions in the unit. And according to data from WWF, latest data, the cheetah is unfortunately threatened in all of these different subspecies, in all of these different spatial units. So it would be considered present in every spatial unit, not viable, not functional, unfortunately. And then the final step is to combine all of the states in each spatial unit to give an overall score. So the states combine to give that species recovery score that ranges from 0 to 100%, where 0% equals a species that's extinct in the wild, and 100% represents a fully recovered species throughout its range. And this is calculated using this formula on the screen. So on the numerator, we have the sum of the weights of each state. And so we can see that in our table down here. Each of our states, absent, present, viable, functional, is assigned a weight. And so we just sum the weights that we've observed in every spatial unit. And then the denominator is the functional weight, so 9, times the number of spatial units. So for our cheetah, that was 5. Multiplying by 100, and this gives you a value from 0 to 100. For our cheetah, remember, it was present in all of its spatial units, which means it gets a value of 3 in each of the 5 spatial units. In our denominator, we take the functional weight times the number of spatial units, and this gives us a score of 33%. And this corresponds to the largely depleted category, if you remember. And this kind of makes intuitive sense if we think about that map of where the cheetah is found today versus where it was found at its baseline. It has a greatly reduced range compared to where it was at that time. Now I'm going to talk just briefly about the second aim of the green status of species, which is to assess the impact of and incentivize conservation action. How do we do that? Well, for any species, you could assess simply the current score of the species from 0 to 100. You could also consider what that score would be in the absence of conservation action today. And if you estimate what that score would be, what the states and the different spatial units would be in the absence of conservation, you get a metric called the conservation legacy. So this is a way that the green status assessment makes the invisible work of conservation visible. What would have been worse if we hadn't done any conservation action to date? You can also project into the future over a 10-year time frame. What is the expected increase in score if we continue the conservation actions we have planned? This gives you a metric called conservation gain. We can also think about what would happen if we stop conservation. And this gives us a metric called conservation dependence. This can be very motivating to funders trying to argue for continued conservation of the species. And finally, we can think 100 years into the future, if everything went right, if we had the funding that we wanted, and the will and buy-in of the people that we wanted, what is the maximum possible score the species could achieve? And this gives us something called the recovery potential. This is a way of thinking about the maximum possible space for recovery for the species. Of course, it has to be realistic. So we have to take into account the species' life history. We have to take into account things like climate change. But if everything else went right, what could we do for the species? And how can we motivate conservation to try and get us closer to that recovery potential? So take-home messages. The green status of species assesses recovery and conservation impact. It is a part of the red list assessment process. It's not in competition with it. But recovery is not just the inverse or opposite of extinction risk. The green status is telling us new complementary information to the red list. The green status of species is not just a list of recovered species. Any species can be assessed, whether it is close to or far from recovery. And something that I hope that you all will engage with is that by 2025, SSC has a goal of conducting 5,000 green status of species assessments to help us understand the state of species recovery around the world. And I hope that you will join us in that goal. We're going to move straight into our next presentation. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function. Becca will answer them, and we'll also have a live Q&A at the end. But up next, we have Dr. Claudia Hermes, who's going to be talking about her application of the green status. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Cool. Can you see that all right? Perfect. Okay, so yeah, I'm Claudia Hermes. I work at BirdLife International, where I do red list assessments of birds. And I'm also involved in green status assessments. And yeah, here I want to give a quick overview of how red list and green status interact, how they tell the story of a species from different perspectives, and how they then together give like the complete picture. First, very quick introduction, because this is basically what Molly just explained. So the red list is a measure of extinction risk of a species, relative extinction risk at the time of assessment. For the red list, we look at parameters that relate to the distribution range of a species, the population size, and the population trend. And then we put these into one of these categories that range from least concern to extinct. The green status, on the other hand, measures a species recovery and also the impact that conservation had in the past, is having at the moment, and may have in the future. And then we can calculate this green score that range from fully recovered to critically depleted. And the red list and the green status, they're complementary tools, so it's not one thing or the other. They both tell a different aspect of the story of a species. And I now want to give you some examples. I don't have the time, unfortunately, to get into too much detail, but I guess they can give a good overview of how these different metrics how they tell the story. So let's start with the California condor. That's the largest vulture of North America. They became almost extinct in the 1980s when the last individuals in the wild were taken to a zoo, and where they started a conservation breeding program. And then very quick after that, reintroduction started, and we have now some condors again in the wild. They are all found in a small area in Western North America. So if you look at a map here, we now have populations in California, a bit further inland in the Rocky Mountains, and some smaller populations in northern Mexico. And as of last year, a few individuals in northern California as well. This is the data from 2020, so the numbers may have changed slightly since then. but the population is extremely small. So we're having some 90 to 100 mature individuals in the wild that are breeding in these 4 subpopulations. Threats are still acting and the mortality in the wild remains high, and the species is still strongly dependent on conservation action, including like continued reintroductions and also medical treatments. On the red list, they are listed as critically endangered. That means they have an extremely high risk of extinction. So this is basically the worst that you can be. But if we now look at the green status, we find that actually the condors, they would be extinct by now without conservation action. It was only because they were taken into the zoos, into captivity, and then reintroduced back into the wild that they are still here. If we look at the indigenous range, this is what you can see here in this pink on that map. We see that they're only found in a very small proportion of the indigenous range, and this is just because of these reintroduction efforts. So that means that the green score is still, it looks very bad, they're critically depleted. But on the other hand, these populations, they are becoming established now. They react well to conservation actions, and they're slowly but steadily recovering. So their recovery potential is actually, it's not looking too bad. It just may take a while, but they have quite a good prospect of actually recolonizing other areas of the indigenous range. So from the red list, we learned that the extinction risk is extremely high, but the green status adds that they're actually on an upward trajectory. So potentially in the future, the extinction risk will be lower. Okay, let's go into another example. I've seen that there are several Colombians on the webinar, so you may be familiar with that one. This is the Antioquia brushfinch. That's a small passerine bird that is endemic to a tiny area in Colombia. And it's quite an interesting case because that species was described only in 2007 from museum specimen. And nobody had seen it in the wild ever until 2018 or 2019, when a few individuals were discovered in an area just north of Medellin. That was the wrong direction. Sorry, let's go here. Yeah, so what is the red list assessment? The Antioquia brushfinch is found in this small area. So this is a screenshot from eBird. This is northern Colombia. And here you can see that their distribution range is very, very small, and there are not many records, so the population is also likewise quite small. With increasing survey effort, obviously there are more individuals located, so I think by now the latest estimate is just a few hundred individuals, so still not large. And yeah, its habitat is already lost and degraded, mainly because of the expansion of agriculture. They're currently listed as critically endangered, but yeah, with the new data that we're getting now, we need to rerun the assessment to see if CR is still the correct category. But for now, the extinction risk remains extremely high. And again, green status assessment, this is not completed yet. This is a work in progress. So this is kind of hypothetical scenario that I'm explaining here. But yeah, as I said, it was described and discovered only recently, so we do not really know much about its indigenous range. But we can guess that probably the range in the population were never really large, just because it is likely that if they were large, they would have been discovered earlier. So potentially their green score, it's not looking too bad. They may be just slightly depleted or moderately depleted. We need to run the assessment to see where they actually fall in, but it's probably not that bad. And yeah, obviously now after the rediscovery, there are systematic surveys carried out and research activities are starting, and yeah, people start to develop conservation strategies. And this will of course give us important information when we try to create these counterfactual scenarios, when we try to assess the impact that conservation may have on that species. But potentially, even though this is a critically endangered species, with just a little bit of effort, we may be able to restore them to a fully recovered state, potentially, to have like viable or functional populations within its range. We don't know, potentially. It's quite an interesting story. Extremely high in the extinction risk, but still, it may be easy to get them back to a fully recovered state. And my last example, so let's leave the Americas, let's go to Asia. It's the greater adjutant. That's a stork that occurs in Southern and Southeast Asia. And yeah, again, let's start with the red list assessment. This assessment is not yet published, but it will be submitted to IUCN soon. So hopefully it should become available on the red list website in December. But the latest population estimates show us that the population, it's moderately small. It's like up to 1,500 mature individuals. And we have two subpopulations, which are at the moment increasing. So we know that the species has declined in the past, but these declines have now stopped. And the populations that we have, they are increasing. The recovery can be attributed to intensive conservation actions like community engagement, protection of habitat, and so on. They will most likely be listed as near threatened on the red list. That does not sound too bad. So can we say job done, the greater adjutant is safe? Let's look at the green status. And this gives us a completely different picture. Because if we now look at the indigenous range here, we see that it was widespread across large areas of Asia, like basically from Pakistan all the way down to Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And it is now extirpated from very, very large areas of this. So we just have these two populations, one in India and the other one in Cambodia. And it has been estimated that the current population is less than 1% of what it was in 1900. So even though we do not have the green status assessment yet, it is probably somewhere in the critically depleted category. So yeah, the threats, they are abated locally, only in some of the spatial units, and but others, the species is just lost. So this is a completely different case, a species that does not have a high extinction risk, but which is still in a very, very bad state if you compare it to its historic baseline. So what can we learn from that? As I said, yeah, the red list and the green status are complementary tools. So they look at different temporal scales. The red list only looks at the extinction risk at the time of the assessment. So the time frame that we use for red list assessments is 3 generations. For many species, so for many like the small birds like Antioquia brushfinch, for example, this would just be 10 years. But the green status compares that to the historic baseline. So what was the status of that species 100 years ago or several hundred years ago, and where may we get to in another 100 years? So this looks at the long-term trajectory of a population. So for example, the greater adjutant, it declined rapidly 100 years ago, but in 3 generations, the populations are increasing. And we also have different spatial scales. The red list takes data from across the range and merges these data into generalized estimates. We look at the population size at a global scale and the population trends at a global scale. But the green status looks at spatial units separately. So yeah, again, for the greater adjutant, it means we just have these 2 spatial units where the population is actually recovering. But all the other spatial units, it is gone, it is extinct. And then, yeah, again, the red list looks at the likelihood of extinction. It does not look at the dependence on conservation. This is what the green status does. So the green status can tell us how dependent is a species on conservation, how urgently does it need action and conservation funding. This is something that the red list does not do, but it is an important aspect, and we need that to like tell the story of a species. Yeah, that's it for me. And over to you, Mike. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. While Mike's getting set up, I'm sure you all have lots of questions based on Claudia's great presentation. As Megan has said in the chat, please do use the Q&A function to ask those questions, which will be either at the bottom of your screen or in the floating toolbar. We can't actually respond to you in the chat, although we will be monitoring it for the live Q&A. So just if you can use the Q&A app, that is the best way to go. But now over to Mike Kaufman for our last presentation of the webinar.
Thanks very much, Molly and Claudia. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Really good to see such great participation. I mean, it's been fascinating seeing people joining from Fiji and Socotra and Virginia and all over the place, and good to see some old friends and some new faces too. So for those of you who I guess are familiar and experienced with the red list, you'll know that there's one thing that the red list system doesn't lack for, and that is a whole bunch of tools and training manuals and guidance and documents and all the rest of it to support individual assessors who are looking to do assessments for their particular species. And the reality is that we're probably going to need the same for the green status of species. And so we've begun very slowly pulling together some of these resources. The reality is that with a session like today, where you only have an hour and Molly has 15 minutes in which to present the green status of species approach, it's impossible to cover everything. It just isn't feasible to go through all the ins and outs of all the things that had to be considered and accounted for in developing the approach and developing the methodology, but also explaining how the system works. So we've had to think of ways of helping assessors who are looking to get into the green status of assessment process to provide them with additional tools and information and resources where they can find this information. And some of that is in the links to the papers that Megan and Molly have shared in the chat. But I just want to run through a couple of those today. I guess the bottom line is that there are two main website links where you can very quickly and easily access these. I've put these up on the screen. Megan is going to pop these in the chat. And for those of you who have the ability to snap a QR code, if you do that now, they'll direct you to the top link, which is to the Red List website, where you'll find a bunch of guidelines and workbooks and all the rest of it. And then the bottom line is to an online training module, which I'm going to say a few words about in a second.
Sorry to interrupt, Mike, but I can't see your screen. Can you, Claudia? Okay.
Yeah.
So if those QR codes are not actually on screen.
Let's try once more. Hang on a minute. Let's try once more. What about now?
It's coming. It might be a whiteboard that we're seeing, actually. Not your slides.
All right, give me a second.
Bear with us, everyone. The fun of webinars and trying to figure out
again.
features on Zoom.
Let's try again. Just give me 1 second now.
And yeah, while we're figuring this out, please do continue to tell us where you're coming from, which specialist group or working group or task force you're a part of. As Mike said, it's really brilliant to see how much engagement and how, such global engagement we're getting on this webinar as well. That looks promising. Yep. Thanks, Mike.
Right. Okay, so there's the QR codes. Apologies for that. Let's assume that everybody's quickly zapped those. We'll obviously make these available in a second. And like I said, Megan will pop the links into the chat. The main thing I wanted to do today is just quickly run through a couple of things. The background and guidelines that are available for supporting assessors with doing assessments. The online learning training module. And then some tools and workbooks that we have available. And I'll also, if time permits, we'll quickly have a whip over to the Red List website just to give you a bit of a glimpse as to where you can access information on the green status assessments, as well as some of the species that have actually had assessments completed. Let's start with the guidelines, because these are, together with the standard, which is freely available for download from the IUCN Red List website in English, French, and Spanish, so all of the IUCN official languages. The guidelines are arguably the most important document that you're going to be using. So if you're familiar with the Red List, you'll be very familiar with the user guidelines or the guidelines for doing Red List assessments. I think they currently stand around 120 pages in length. And the importance of the guidelines cannot be overstated, because it's extremely difficult to change the Red List standard, or indeed to change the green status standard, because of the approval protocols that go into it. But it's much easier to change the guidelines. And so as we learn new things, and as we do more and more assessments for different species, and we come to understanding how best to apply the system and account for different types of nuances and the different things, or the different realities of doing assessments of different species. We can capture all of those in the guidelines. Now, the current version that is available online date from December 2020, so they're actually a little bit old now themselves. We are in the process of undertaking a major revision of them, accounting for quite a number of feedback that has come up in the last couple of years of both doing test assessments, but also as people have actually been doing actual assessments for the green status of species. And so probably, almost certainly by the end of the year, we will have what is most likely to be a version 2 of the guidelines available. They're currently, like I say, available for download from the Red List website. They also, in addition to providing very useful guidance on interpreting the standard, they also contain information for understanding what documentation needs to accompany your assessment, because very much like a Red List assessment, where there are required minimum documentation standards that apply to a Red List assessment, without which you cannot be published on the Red List, the exact same applies to the green status of species. So if you want to understand a little bit more about those documentation requirements, they are all captured in detail in the guidelines document. Right. The second thing is, which is also available on the Red List website page, is a whole suite of tools and workbooks, and almost certainly this will be something that will expand and grow over time, and that we will continue to add to as it becomes clear where the particular needs are and where assessors are calling for particular support. The three main things I wanted to flag are the instructions for conducting an assessment. So this is almost, if you like, kind of like a written explanation of what Molly just gave a verbal explanation of it. It talks the assessor through the process of conducting an assessment, starting with what you need to do to estimate your indigenous range, how you would then take that indigenous range and divide it up or delineate it into spatial units. Once you've delineated into spatial units, how do you assess the state, and so forth. So it actually helps, it provides a written documentation of all the different steps that are involved in undertaking an assessment. And to accompany that, we've, well, I say we, it's actually mostly been Molly and Resset and a few others, have developed a couple of assessment workbooks. Now, these are currently Excel-based assessment workbooks. And they're extremely useful because what they allow you to do is to input a lot of your documentation, and then they will automatically calculate all of the associated parameters, in particular the species recovery score, as well as the conservation impact metrics. And we're currently developing an approach so that the information that's in these workbooks can then automatically be translated into SIS. At the moment, we haven't quite finished all of the work that is required in the Species Information Service. That's the same system that you would use for capturing information for a Red List assessment. We haven't quite finished making all of the tweaks to SIS that are necessary to capture everything to do with the green status of species assessment. There are a couple of reasons for that. The resources are there, but it'll probably be until the end of the year where we have the mechanism to fully document a green status of species in the Species Information Service. In the meantime, if you're looking to do an assessment, these workbooks are incredibly helpful. They help automate a lot of the functionality through the system, and they produce some really nice and nifty graphs. There are two different types of workbooks. There's one for what we call the default weights, where the assessment of state is based on a scoring system of 0 to absent to 9 for functional. And then there are what we call the more fine scale weights. And those are, you're probably less likely to use them, but there may be some situations where it may be necessary to use the fine scale workbook. Those are actually explained within the guidelines. And if you have any questions on when or where it may be more appropriate to use either, please do reach out. And then lastly, there's a state calculator tool, which is actually a web-based form that will help you where you need to make an estimation or a determination of the state in a particular spatial unit. So these are some of the tools that are available. There are links to them directly from the Green Status of Species page on the website that I showed up earlier. Almost certainly we will continue to add to them over time. We're also looking into ways to translate most of them into other languages so that they can be available to support those working in non-English languages. Now, the big one I want to flag is, of course, the online training module. So this, for those of you who are familiar with the Red List, many of you may have done the Red List online training course, which is available on a website that the Nature Conservancy run called conservationtraining.org. It's a fantastic resource for anybody doing Red List assessments. It's been heavily subscribed to over the years, and we've spent a huge amount of time over the last 18 months, I would say, largely thanks to some funding and support that the organization Rewild secured from a private donor to develop a similar course for the Green Status of Species. It's completely free to log in and to register. All you have to do is create a login account and sign up. And once you're there, all you do is you look for the IUCN courses. I would step you through it now, but time, unfortunately, does not permit. You have a look for the IUCN courses. You'll see the Red List course and some others offered by the Conservation Planning Specialist Group and others. But you'll very quickly see the Green Status of Species course there. There are currently 7 modules with about 14 lessons, if I'm not mistaken. Not everything is upline yet. We've still got a couple of additional modules that we need to develop, as well as a nice exam. For anybody who's done the Red List exam, you'll know that it's a bit of a toughie. So I don't know if we'll necessarily go the same route with the Green Status of Species, but we do want to provide some kind of a exam for folks to test their knowledge. But I would strongly encourage you to please go up there, have a look and give it a whirl. It goes into the details of the concepts in much greater detail. And at the moment, it's only available in English, but we are right at this point in time in the process of translating it into French and into Spanish. We expect both of those translations to be available probably around late October, November. And that should roughly coincide with the remaining modules that we plan to develop in the system. So as I say, it's completely free to attend. There are it will step you through a series of slides, and then at the end of each module, there are some questions where it'll kind of test you on your knowledge. It'll provide feedback if you provide the wrong answers, or indeed even if you provide the right ones. But we're really keen to get your feedback and your input. We've already had a number of people who've been using and testing the system. So please do give it a whirl. And we look forward to hearing from those of you who've had the opportunity to use it. I'm conscious of time, so I probably won't go to the Red List website, Molly, in the interest of rather opening up the floor to questions.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you so much, Mike. Hopefully you all are feeling encouraged by those resources that are available to you. At this point, I'd like to invite Becca. Oh, you've turned your camera on. Well done. So everyone, this is Dr. Becca Young, who is also part of the Green Status Task Force, and she has been carefully monitoring the questions you've submitted. So Becca, if you don't mind moderating, throwing us some questions, hopefully we can answer as many as we can in the time remaining.
Sure, thank you. And there's been some really great questions to the point that I haven't been able to keep up with them all, but hopefully we can get through some good ones now. So one that actually came up very early on, and I think is an interesting one, is about the use of ex situ populations. So why are ex situ populations not included in the Green Status Assessment when they can be integral for species recovery, particularly thinking in terms of extinct and extinct in the wild species?
I'm happy to take this first one. It's been a while since I've been chatting. So this is a question that comes up a lot. And the main reason that ex situ populations don't contribute to the current species recovery score is the ultimate goal is really to recover species and populations of species in the wild. So that's the ultimate goal with the green status. However, that's not to say that the assessment entirely discounts XC2 populations. For example, when we think about the future scenarios, so the potential conservation gain within the next 10 years or recovery potential within the next 100 years, you could have a species that is extinct in the wild, but has conservation gain or has recovery potential because and only because of those XC2 populations. And so even though it doesn't contribute to the current score, so the species recovery score, those XC2 populations do contribute to the conservation impact metric. So they're not entirely forgotten.
Brilliant, thank you, Molly. So then the next question we had was about, is genetic diversity factored into species recovery? So thinking about if genetically distinct populations are lost, can a species truly be considered fully recovered?
Anyone like to take that one? You're also welcome to answer, Becca.
Well, I will say that this is one that has come up from sort of discussions outside of this as well. So there is thoughts on sort of how to integrate it. From what I've been working on so far, it's something that we can think about integrating, for example, genetic models into the scenarios. So if you are able to sort of model the genetics and see the impact that the additional loss of genetics of the gene pool could have on the future recovery of the species, that's something that can be factored in when thinking about those future scenarios. But at the moment, it's not sort of really built into it.
And if there is one thing, if you do a close read of the guidelines that Mike mentioned, so obviously there's so much more that we can talk about today, but when it comes to assessing functionality, we actually do talk about how genetic diversity and loss of diversity could be factored into deciding whether or not the population in a spatial unit is functional. So have a look at the guidelines. We're still, as Mike said, updating the guidelines as we learn more and learn more or see more cases. So that's something we're definitely going to keep thinking about.
Perfect, thank you. So the next one is thinking about plants. So someone, Alan, has said he's interested to know how people are accurately inferring historical distributions of plant taxa where records are minimal.
Mike, any thoughts on this one? It could be, I suppose, not necessarily just plants, but any sort of species with few records.
Yeah, so Alan, I guess, so one key thing to emphasize here is, well, there's a couple of things. So one is there are some interesting approaches now to trying to understand pre-1900 distributions by trying to kind of trawl the historical literature or historical distributions of species that might otherwise have gone, sort of been forgotten and neglected. So Molly and I actually have a colleague who is actually very much in the throes of looking into ways of doing this at the moment. And I think that could be, this is kind of making use of AI and machine learning approaches, so modern technology for trying to harness these historical data records, and that could actually be quite transformative for green status of species assessments. There are probably going to be a number of, and we've already encountered this, there are a number of cases where we have done test assessments for species where it's quite hard to have any level of confidence that we have correctly estimated the historical distribution of the species, because sometimes you're not sure whether it really was that species that occurred there or not, or you doubt the nature and the documentation of the record that's concerned. And the reality is that uncertainty is always going to be present, but that's okay, as long as you are as transparent as possible in documenting the basis for your indigenous range. That at least ensures that in future and in time, it becomes repeatable. So people can understand, okay, I understand how this assessor has made a determination that this is the way they have defined indigenous range. I think they're wrong because they've now, maybe they've discovered X records that were not accounted for previously. But as long as you are explicitly clear in how you are accounting for the way you have defined the indigenous range, that's okay. So yes, it may mean that unfortunately, there is some assessments that are either artificially inflated or otherwise. But under the circumstances, as long as it's being properly and efficiently documented, that's probably okay.
I would also just add to that, that just like with the red list assessments, these assessments undergo review. So it will have multiple people checking. So you'll have green status expert reviewer and also species expert reviewers. So there's a couple of sort of safety nets there to make sure that multiple people agree on the indigenous range. Cool, thank you very much for that answer, Mike. So one which may slightly put you on the spot in terms of the sort of past development of it, but I think it's a nice point from Christina that the green status is a great way of sort of emphasizing the positive side of conservation. So she did wonder on why the term depletion is used.
We had a long conversation on this one, didn't we, Molly?
Oh, absolutely. We had focus groups. We had all sorts. I think it's very challenging. The way that I kind of hold it in my head is that the green status, while it can be a very optimistic framework, and we hope that it does motivate conservation action, it's also a way to think about changes that have occurred due to human activity and ways to think about how we need to elevate our own conservation ambitions relative to what we see today. And so while it is quite optimistic in the idea that we might have large recovery potential for some species, I think having it against that baseline of, we have actually depleted a species pretty far from that baseline is a useful thing to think about. So if you don't think of the green status as purely an optimistic framing, then it starts to make a bit more sense. But I wouldn't want that to take away from the fact that this sort of way of thinking about species recovery and conservation status can be really inspirational, can be really optimistic and motivating. It's, I suppose, trying to prevent the truest picture that it can.
Brilliant, thanks, Molly. So going to a question from Jessie. So this is something that happens quite commonly now with the way that the habitats are now found. So current range of a species can still be wide and similar to the historic range, but it might now be highly fragmented. And so we do see a lot of fragmented populations in assessments. So how is this taken into account when doing the assessments?
Claudia or Mike?
Yeah, probably I can take that. Yeah, as Becca said, this happens a lot. So I think this is then easiest reflected in the delimitation of the spatial units. You can have, well, when you have like ecologically separated populations, then you can assign them different spatial units and assess these separately. And then you will find that some of your units, you have populations that are still in a fairly good state, while in the other units, it is already locally extinct. And this then is then kind of, combined together to get your green score. So this is actually, it can be easily reflected in that.
Brilliant, thank you. So I have now a question about kind of when we would consider something fully recovered. So if we have a theoretical case where the current range of a species is corresponding to the maximum potential range that is now available because of loss of habitat in the historical range, could we ever assess this species as fully recovered if it was viable and ecologically functional in all of its sort of current possible range, but not its historic range? So I'm happy to take this one on if you want a break from questioning. Yes, so unfortunately, we do have situations where large parts of the indigenous range are lost and unlikely to ever be recovered. So in those situations, we wouldn't see a species reach that 100% fully recovered mark. It's not uncommon at all in these assessments for them to not reach 100% fully recovered because of that simple fact of how much the landscape has changed. The idea is that it can still give us a more realistic state of where the species could get to. So there's no point aiming for fully recovered if actually huge areas of the indigenous range have been completely urbanized and it's no longer suitable. But actually it will give us a realistic cutoff of where we could expect this species to reach a state of recovery. So unless anyone has anything to add, I can go on to another one. So there is an interesting question of how do we capture uncertainty for individual spatial unit estimates in the final assessment? This is a very important one.
Mike?
Do you want me to do it, Molly, or?
You go ahead. No, I'll jump in if I have anything else.
Yeah, so the main great question. I mean, needless to say, there's uncertainty throughout the system, but I guess the main way that we account for uncertainty in the system is through asking assessors when they are assessing the state of the species in each spatial unit. So whether the species is absent, whether it's present, viable, or functional. They have to stipulate an upper bound, a lower bound, and then within those two bounds, what they think is most likely. So, so to give you an example, obviously, if a species is, if you have a species that occurs in 3 different spatial units, and you have absolutely no doubt that the species is absent in one of those because it's extinct, then it's absolutely fine. Your upper bound is absent, your lower bound is absent if your most likely is absent. But you might have a situation where in one of the other spatial units, you're not sure, right? You think it's, if you do an assessment, it's present. However, it's possible it could be viable, but you know that it's definitely not functional. So you would make your upper bound as viable. Your lower bound would be present because you know that it's definitely there. And then you would have to make a decision, right? Which of those two is most likely? Is it present, or is it viable? That is the most likely, and you might select present as the most likely one. And so what the system will do is it will take account of those. It will produce a score that is based on your most likely figures, but it will have a bound. And so the way that the system accounts for this is by essentially not forcing, but basically forcing assessors to provide some parameterization around their estimates of the state in each spatial unit.
Brilliant, thank you. So in the last couple of minutes, there is just one question left. Oh, another one's just popped in. So there was one question, which is a quick one to answer in the Q&A. So if we don't consider the ex situ populations, is it applicable to add a definition of free-ranging populations? So we do define in the guidelines that it is specifically talking about wild individuals. And so individuals not in the wild aren't included in the assessment until they are released into the wild. So that is already in there, but just not in the depth that we're in today.
And if you're familiar with the Red List guidelines, any population that would be considered for the Red List assessment would also be considered for the green status assessment.
Perfect, thank you. And then a really crucial question, actually. So where can we find the published green status assessments? So they are on the Red List. At the moment, there's not a huge number that are published on the Red List because of some of the things Mike said about with SIS. But you can find them if you go into the advanced searches and you can tick the box for green status, and all of the published green status assessments will come up there. And they show up alongside the Red List, so you can have a look at the comparisons quite nicely. And how do we participate in the goal for 5,000 by 2025? So that's exactly the kind of question we want. So Molly and I are helping to facilitate people doing assessments. So are contact details shared with the advert for this?
I'm not sure, but what I've just done, and everyone on the chat can't see it yet, but hopefully Megan can, is I've put a link to a Google Doc. And if you follow that link, you can register your interest in conducting an assessment. Becca and I will be in touch with you with all the information that you need to chat about any questions you have. And that will help us get closer to that 5,000 species by 2025. So please do click that link if you're interested.
Brilliant, thank you. So that actually brings us to bang on 3 o'clock. There are 1 or 2 more questions. So I don't know if we can maybe put a line to not send any more questions, and we could just answer this last one that is in the assessment and then wrap up. Okay. So this one that has just come in is, if we're working on a critically endangered species based on the last red list assessment, how long should we do the conservation action such as habitat protection, artificial spawning grounds, reduced invasive species, to make it so the species could be concluded to be recovered? So I'm not sure I 100% understand the question, but I think it's kind of asking about how long certain actions need to be done to consider the species recovered, which I would have thought would be very different on sort of a case-by-case basis, but it would likely be fairly long term. Most of the assessments that we look at, when we see changes sort of within 10 years and within 100 years, you don't necessarily see changes happening within the 10-year time period. So if I've understood that correctly, I would say you'd be expecting sort of decades to see changes. Anyone else have anything to add?
I would say one of the nice things about the assessment is that it does look over multiple timeframes. So within the 10-year timeframe, we're thinking about what are the expected impacts of the actual ongoing and planned actions, which you might sort of assess and see, well, that's not getting us as far as we'd like it to go. And then you can think about the actions possible in 100 years and see what sort of recovery potential those would yield.
Brilliant.
Anyone else?
Becca, if I can, I just thought it might be, if I could just beg forbearance, there was a question from Patricia, I think, about marine taxa. It may just be worth commenting on that. Because certainly in the red list realm, there have often been concerns that, you know, the red list doesn't work for certain marine and aquatic species, especially those that are wide ranging and have lots of population structure and so on. Actually, there are 2 things that make the green status particularly interesting, I think, for those same kinds of species in the aquatic environment. So one is when you think of species that have been historically exploited, especially some of the cetaceans, humpback whale, things like that, which have undergone these historical declines but have now stabilized and are currently least concerned. The big advantage with the green status of species is providing that historical context. So there's often been this concern that that's something the red list doesn't do, because the red list is designed to reflect extinction risk. What the green status of species can do is it can show, yes, these species are least concerned from an extinction risk point of view, but actually when you look at them relative to their population levels in the 1800s or the 1750s or whatever, they are critically depleted. And so that is a major utility of the green status and complementarity of the green status species to the red list. The other one is that because it splices the range up into these spatial units, it introduces the opportunity to understand what is going on across the range of the species. Now, of course, you can do that within the red list, right? You can do subpopulation assessments and subspecies assessments and so forth. But as part of the green status of species, you have to do it. It's actually compulsory. You have to divide the range up into these spatial units. And that provides this better understanding of what is actually going on across the range of the species. It doesn't necessarily just reflect a single value across the entire range. Now, that, to Molly's point, that's not to suggest that it's necessarily straightforward. There are going to be complexities. These complexities will indeed exist for many different species. And indeed, we're always looking for groups and individuals willing and interested to test things and apply the system to their species. So we're definitely still in the learning. I mean, these are early days. You know, the red list has been going for 50 years. We've got 2 years into green status of species. It's obviously a bit longer in terms of thinking through the methodology, but we're kind of early days yet. And so we're very strongly encouraging people who want to participate and collaborate in testing the system further, applying the green status of species to your species, and let's try and work through some of these things together.
Couldn't have put it better myself, Mike. And I think on that note, it's probably a good place to wrap up, unless, Becca, there's any more questions. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to everyone watching this. Thank you for your interest in the IUCN Green Status of Species. Thank you to all of our panelists and to Reverse the Red for hosting us. If you missed any part of this session or want to share it, it will be posted to the Reverse the Red YouTube page within a few days. So you can share it around or review the presentations that we've had. And if you like this webinar and want to see more wonderful conservation webinars, check out Reverse the Red's social media and their website for details of upcoming webinars as well. So thanks very much. Have a great day. And yeah, please get in touch with any questions.